America, you have a right to be stupid. I am here to tell you that this right also exists in South America. Chile has a right to be stupid.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Nicholas. Thank you also to Doug van Appen. Thank you to Axel Kaiser for all the work that you have done. And I want you to join me in giving the Three Musketeers, all their co-workers at the Foundation for Progress, and all you supporters of their work, please a warm round of applause for this great foundation. It proves Chileans also have the right to be smart. Maybe it's appropriate, ladies and gentlemen, to give this speech on the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was on this very night, exactly 100 years ago, 7th of November in the Gregorian calendar, to the 25th of October in the Julian calendar then used in Russia, hence the October Revolution happened in November. It was then, 100 years ago, this very night, that the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet ordered armed workers and soldiers to storm the Winter Palace, seat of Alexander Kerensky's provisional government. To be precise, it was attacked at 9:40 p.m. and captured by 2 a.m. a century ago. The consequences of this coup, for that was how it was reported, were world-shaking indeed. According to the estimates in the Black Book of Communism, the grand total of victims of communism was between 85 and 100 million for the 20th century as a whole. Mao Zedong alone, as the historian Frank Dakota has shown, accounted for tens of millions of lives cut short. 2 million between 1949 and 1951. Another 3 million by the end of the 1950s, a staggering 45 million in the man-made famine known as the Great Leap Forward, and yet more in the mayhem of the Cultural Revolution. According to the lowest estimate, the total number of Soviet citizens who lost their lives as a direct result of Stalin's policies was more than 20 million. And a quarter of those died in the years after World War II. All communist regimes everywhere, without exception, were merciless in their treatment of class enemies, so-called. From the North Korea of the Kims to the Vietnam of Ho Chi Minh, from the Ethiopia of Mengistu Haile Mariam to the Angola of Agostinho Neto. Pol Pot was the worst of them all. But even Castro's Cuba was no workers' paradise. Communist regimes were aggressive too, overtly invading country after country during the Cold War. Did South Korea invade North Korea? Did South Vietnam invade and take over North Vietnam? I don't think so. Moreover, we now know from the secret documents brought to the West by Vasily Mitrokhin and others just how extensive and ruthless the KGB system of international espionage and subversion was. I say all this tonight to remind us all that the threats to classical liberalism, to the fundamental political freedoms of conscience, speech and assembly, and the economic freedoms to exchange freely and own property securely, have been immense over the past century. Now, you might conclude from the muted way in which this centenary is being celebrated or marked in Russia today, that the threat has passed. And we can all sleep more easily in our beds without having to look under them for reds. But you would be wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, I can think of at least 7 different threats to liberty that are alive and kicking 100 years after the storming of the Winter Palace. Now, first, there is, of course, the unreconstructed left, still committed to socialism, still committed to revolution. Yes, these are the people with the busts of Lenin on their desks and the copies of Mao's little red book in their pockets. There are more of them than one might think. As it happens, one of those people is the leader of the Labour Party in my native United Kingdom, and most likely its next Prime Minister. Second, there's the new left of the radicalized university campuses. Those who have embraced the principles of political correctness, who conceive of society as a coalition of racial and sexual and other minorities, all in various ways oppressed by soon-to-be-dead white males. These are the people who wish to close down free speech at universities by creating a culture of safe spaces and trigger warnings and no platforming or merely drowning out any speaker that they find objectionable. These are the witch-finders of our times, crying out hate speech in just the same way their 17th century predecessors cried heresy. Third, there are the new populists of both the left and the right. Now, populism is a familiar ailment in Latin America. These days it appears to have become a global epidemic. Populism, as you know, comes like ice cream in socialist countries in only 2 flavors: raspberry and chocolate. The leftist red, the rightist brown. The left populists offer ice cream today and tomorrow via expropriation and redistribution. The right populists offer ice cream today and tomorrow via immigration restriction and protectionism. But both flavors of populist are impatient with the rule of law, the ultimate safeguard of individual liberty. And both flavors of populist nearly always turn out to be more corrupt than the previous regime that they accused of being corrupt. So that's 3 out of 7. I'm not done. Fourth are the new authoritarians. Now, if you count them up, there aren't more autocratic states in the world than there were 20 years ago. despite the forebodings of many commentators back in the mid-1990s. And yet, we see improvements in the efficiency of autocracy that are truly disquieting, at least in China. My old friend and debating sparring partner, Fareed Zakaria, of CNN, wrote almost rhapsodically about the implications of the 19th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which ended just 2 weeks ago. This party Congress, he wrote, made clear that Xi Jinping is no ordinary leader. His grip on power is far more secure than that of his immediate predecessors. For the rest of his life, Xi and his ideas will dominate the Communist Party of China. The Economist declared that Xi Jinping's grip on China, and I quote, is tighter than any leader's since Mao. No. Ladies and gentlemen, that is no cause for celebration. It is cause for trepidation. I'm especially concerned that the wonders of modern information technology may be giving totalitarianism a new lease of life, just as we thought it was defunct. As the big Chinese tech companies, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, make available the personal data of all Chinese netizens to the party, Xi Jinping has power at his disposal that would make Mao turn in his grave out of sheer envy. Fifth, there are those who repudiate the first principles of free society in the name of their religion. The Western world, I think, continues to misunderstand the nature of the threat posed to it by political Islam, or Islamism. Too many Western leaders still adhere to the orthodoxy that we have a problem of violent extremism, and that it will arouse Islamophobia if we dare to mention that this violence is too often perpetrated in the name of Allah. Too many governments refuse seriously to crack down on the non-violent extremism of the radical preachers who travel from mosque to Islamic center all over the world, spreading their message of antipathy towards the infidel. My wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, can't be here with us tonight for the happy reason that she's just given birth to our second son, Wee Campbell. But Ayaan, whose autobiography was entitled Infidel, has taught me more than anyone else about what freedom means, what it is to be unfree, and the threat to freedom, the threat to the equality of the sexes posed by political Islam. As she has argued recently, there would be no acts of jihad, of violence, like the recent massacre just the other day in downtown New York, claimed the lives of some young Argentinians out on a celebratory holiday. Had it not been for the initial process of dawah, proselytizing, that paves the way for terrorism, sowing the seeds of intolerance. I come to my sixth enemy of freedom. I fear that all these other enemies I've listed so far are flourishing in the hothouse atmosphere created by the giant network platforms of our time. Google, Facebook, and Twitter, to name only the most important of these internet companies, have created unparalleled connectivity in our time. Yet few people, even a year ago, fully appreciated the extent to which these networks could be abused by the purveyors of fake news under fake identities. Once upon a time, back in the 1990s, cyberspace was sold to us as a libertarian paradise where anything would go and the writ of the state would not run. Guess what? It turns out that cyberspace is in fact a playground for all the threats to freedom I've listed so far. The leftists, the social justice warriors, the populists, the authoritarians, and the jihadists. Cyberspace turns out to promote not harmony, not the global community that Mark Zuckerberg dreamt of when he established Facebook, but polarization and extremism. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, there's one more enemy of freedom that I fear above all the others. And that is the enemy within. Oh, they say that they share our belief in freedom. They say they are themselves liberals. And yet, as so often in the past, they appease the extremists. They capitulate to the oppressors. There was a lot of curiosity amongst Western intellectuals in the great Bolshevik experiment that began a century ago. After Lenin and his gang had consolidated their grip on power, largely through acts of terror perpetrated during a prolonged civil war, many intellectuals from the West visited the Soviet Union to see for themselves what the workers' paradise looked like. Margaret Cole recalled a visit to Moscow with the Fabian leader Sidney Webb in 1934. Imagine, 1934 in the Soviet Union. The terror, purges, show trials, and a devastating man-made famine in Ukraine. Here's what she wrote. As we inspected factories, farms, cooperative stores, schools, hospitals, maternity homes, reformatories, community centres, parks of recreation and rest, visited crowded theatres and opera houses, seated in the state box or side by side with rough-handed peasants and workers, attended trade union meetings or industrial courts, or watched, at work or at play, healthy and happy-looking peasants and workers, young mothers and children, Sidney would whisper to me, with the relish of the scientist whose theoretic proposition has stood the test of practical experiment, see, it works, it works. Today, one hears the same tone from similar people. My favorite examples are the apologists for the Chavista regime in Venezuela. The likes of Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, not to mention the film director Oliver Stone and the actor Sean Penn. This was Chomsky in 2009. What's so exciting about at last visiting Venezuela is that I can see how a better world is being created. quote, unquote. 2 years previously, Naomi Klein hailed Venezuela as a place where, I quote, citizens had renewed their faith in the power of democracy to improve their lives. Chavez's 21st century socialism, she wrote, had created a zone of relative economic calm and predictability. Yes, that's what she wrote. I went to Venezuela then. You did not need to be a very deep and insightful analyst to see where that regime was headed and to see where that regime was taking the people of Venezuela, which was to hell. Shame on them. As much shame on them as should be heaped on the apologists of the Stalin regime in the 1930s. In 1948, an Italian social democratic paper, L'Umanità, came up with an apt term for such people. You may remember it. Useful idiots. They, ladies and gentlemen, those useful idiots are the most dangerous enemies of our freedoms. And that's why organizations such as the Foundation for Progress are so important. If that's Noam Chomsky, would you tell him I'm busy? That is why you must never relax your vigilance and never reduce your support for what Axel and his colleagues are doing. There were too many, way too many, useful idiots in the past century. Self-styled liberals who were in fact fellow travelers on deeply illiberal trains. In this century, ladies and gentlemen, what we need are not useful idiots. We need watchful idealists. And I believe that is what, for 5 powerfully impactful years, Axel and his team have been. Ladies and gentlemen, here's to the next 5 years, the next 95 years of watchful idealism. Thank you very much.